The cold Atlantic wind cut through the metal hull of the USS Samuel Chase like a knife through flesh, carrying with it the salt spray and the weight of destiny. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell stood on the deck, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles had turned white beneath the grime and calluses of 3 years of service. Around him, hundreds of young American soldiers huddled in their uniforms, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed terror. It was June 5th, 1944, and every man aboard knew that tomorrow would change their lives forever, if they survived it. James was 26 years old, though the lines etched around his eyes made him look older. He came from a small town in Kansas called Meadowbrook, where his father had owned a hardware store on Main Street and his mother had taught Sunday school at the Baptist church. He had grown up believing in the American dream, the idea that hard work, integrity and faith could build a life worth living. That dream had brought him across an ocean, into the belly of a ship, headed toward a beach in France that most of these boys had never heard of until a few weeks ago. Omaha Beach. The name had become synonymous with the mission, whispered in briefings, studied on maps until the geography was burned into their minds. Next to him stood Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Sullivan, a kid from Boston who had lied about his age to enlist. Bobby was 19 now, though he had been 17 when he signed up, forging his father's signature on the recruitment papers. His father had been a dock worker who drank too much and dreamed too little, and Bobby had wanted more than the life that waited for him in the shadow of the harbor. He had wanted to matter, to be part of something greater than himself. Now, as the ship rolled beneath his feet and the coast of France drew closer with each passing hour, he wondered if he had asked for too much. "You think it'll be as bad as they say, Sarge?" Bobby asked, his voice barely audible over the wind and the groan of the ship's engines. James turned to look at him, seeing his own younger self in those wide, uncertain eyes. He had asked similar questions once, back in North Africa, before he learned that some questions didn't have answers worth hearing. But Bobby deserved honesty, or at least as much honesty as James could give, without crushing what remained of his hope. "It'll be worse," James said quietly. "Everything they told us in the briefings. Multiply it by 10. The Germans have been fortifying that beach for 4 years. They know we're coming, even if they don't know exactly when. They've got machine gun nests, artillery positions, obstacles in the water, mines on the beach. They've turned that stretch of sand into a killing ground." Bobby swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "But we're going to win, right? I mean, we have to win. We're Americans." James looked out at the dark water, at the hundreds of ships that surrounded them, each one carrying its cargo of young men toward the shores of occupied Europe. The invasion fleet stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to American industrial might and organizational genius. Somewhere out there in the darkness, paratroopers were already dropping behind enemy lines, securing bridges and crossroads, disrupting German communications. The Air Force had been pounding the coastal defenses for weeks. Everything that could be done to give them a chance had been done. "We'll win," James said, and he meant it. "But the price is going to be high. Some of us won't make it off that beach. Some of us won't make it to the beach. When that ramp drops tomorrow morning, you keep moving forward. You don't stop, you don't look back, you don't think about anything except reaching the seawall. You understand me?" "I understand, Sarge." If you're watching this story unfold and want to hear more about the courage and sacrifice of those who fought for freedom, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. The briefing that evening was held in the cramped quarters below deck, where the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. Captain William Harrison stood before a map of Omaha Beach, his pointer tapping against the various sectors that had been designated for the assault. Easy red, fox green, dog white, meaningless names that would soon be written in blood. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions that must have been churning inside him. Tomorrow morning at 06:30 hours, we will be landing on Omaha Beach as part of the first wave. Our objective is to secure the beachhead and advance inland to link up with the airborne forces. Intelligence suggests that we will face elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, which is more heavily fortified than initially anticipated. A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. The 352nd was a combat-tested unit, not the second-rate occupation troops they had been led to expect. James felt his jaw tighten. The intelligence had been wrong before. In Sicily, in Italy, men had died because of bad intelligence. But there was no turning back now. The machinery of war had been set in motion, and they were all caught in its gears. The naval bombardment will begin at 05:50 hours, Harrison continued. The Air Force will make their runs at 0600. By the time we hit the beach, the German defenses should be significantly weakened. Your job is to get off the beach as quickly as possible, find cover, and begin advancing on the designated strongpoints. Sergeant Mitchell's squad will be targeting the pillbox at coordinates Delta 7. Any questions? There were always questions, but most of them couldn't be answered. How bad will it be? Will I be brave enough? Will I see my family again? These were the questions that haunted every man in that room, but no one voiced them. Instead, they studied their maps, checked their equipment, and tried to find some measure of peace in the rituals of preparation. After the briefing, James gathered his squad in a corner of the deck. There were 12 of them, though he knew that statistically not all of them would survive the next 24 hours. Besides Bobby Sullivan, there was Corporal Daniel Hayes, a farmer's son from Iowa who could fix anything mechanical. Private Tommy Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China and who carried a letter from them in his pocket at all times. Private First Class Marcus Washington, who had grown up in segregated Alabama and had joined the army to prove that black Americans were just as patriotic and capable as anyone else. Private Joseph Kowalski, whose grandparents had fled Poland and who spoke fluent German, and 7 others, each with their own story, their own reasons for being here. "Listen up," James said, keeping his voice low. "I'm not going to lie to you about what we're facing tomorrow. It's going to be hell, but I've seen you all in training and I know what you're capable of. We're going to stick together, we're going to watch each other's backs, and we're going to make it through this. When that ramp drops, follow me. Stay low, move fast, and don't bunch up. The Germans will be aiming for groups. Spread out and keep moving." "What if someone gets hit?" Tommy Chen asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "The medics will handle the wounded," James said. "Your job is to keep moving. I know that sounds cold, but if we stop to help every man who falls, we'll all die on that beach. The only way forward is forward. Once we secure the beachhead, once we have cover and can organize, then we can help the wounded. But in those first few minutes, momentum is everything." Marcus Washington spoke up, his deep voice cutting through the wind. "My daddy told me before I shipped out that fear is natural, but courage is a choice. He said that every man who ever did something worth remembering was scared when he did it. They just chose to act anyway." James nodded. "Your daddy was a wise man. We're all scared. Anyone who says they're not is either lying or a fool. But tomorrow, we're going to choose courage. We're going to choose to do what needs to be done, not for glory or medals, but because freedom depends on it. Because there are people back home counting on us. Because the world needs us to succeed." The night passed slowly, each hour marked by the sound of the ship's bell and the changing of the watch. Some men tried to sleep, curled up in their bunks or on the deck, using their packs as pillows. Others wrote letters home, final messages to loved ones that they hoped would never need to be delivered. James wrote to his parents, to his younger sister Emily, telling them how proud he was to serve, how much he loved them, how he believed in what they were fighting for. He didn't mention his fear or his doubts. Those were his alone to carry. Bobby Sullivan sat with his back against a bulkhead, staring at a photograph he had pulled from his wallet. It showed a young woman with dark curls and a bright smile, standing in front of a Boston brownstone. "That's Mary," he said when he noticed James looking. "We were supposed to get married when I came back. I promised her father I'd take care of her, give her a good life. He didn't want me to enlist, said I should stay and work at the factory, but I couldn't. How could I look at myself in the mirror, knowing other men were fighting while I stayed safe?" "You'll get back to her," James said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "You'll get married, have kids, grow old together. But first, you have to survive tomorrow. How do you do it, Sarge? How do you keep going when you've seen what you've seen?" James thought about North Africa, about the desert sun and the smell of burning tanks. He thought about Sicily, about the young German soldier he had killed in hand-to-hand combat, barely older than Bobby, whose face he still saw in his dreams. He thought about Italy, about the mountains and the mud, and the endless grinding advance through enemy territory. "Do you find something to hold on to?" he said finally. "For some men it's faith, for others it's the guy next to them. For me, it's the belief that what we're doing matters, that we're not just soldiers following orders, but Americans fighting for something bigger than ourselves. Democracy, freedom, the right of people to live without tyranny, these things are worth dying for. And when the fear gets too much, when I want to curl up and hide, I think about all the people who can't fight, who are depending on us to fight for them. That gives me the strength to keep going." As dawn approached, the sea began to change. The smooth, rolling waves gave way to chop and foam as they neared the coast. The sky lightened from black to grey, revealing a world shrouded in mist and uncertainty. The naval bombardment began right on schedule, a thunderous barrage that shook the ship and lit up the horizon with flashes of fire. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. James and his squad assembled at their designated landing craft, checking their equipment one final time. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, wire cutters, medical supplies, everything they would need to fight and survive. The landing craft was a flat-bottomed boat with a ramp at the front, designed to carry 36 men from the ship to the shore. It offered no protection, no cover. It was simply a means of delivery, a way to deposit human cargo onto a hostile beach. The crew began loading the landing crafts, and James led his squad down the rope ladder and into the boat. The craft rocked violently in the rough water, and several men lost their footing, falling hard against the metal sides. The Navy coxswain at the helm, a young sailor who looked barely old enough to shave, gave them a thumbs-up that was probably meant to be reassuring, but only served to highlight how young they all were. As more landing crafts filled and pulled away from the Samuel Chase, James looked back at the ship one last time. It had been their home for the crossing, a piece of America in the middle of the Atlantic. Now they were leaving it behind, heading toward a shore where men would die by the hundreds, where the fate of the world hung in the balance. The journey to the beach took 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. The landing craft pitched and rolled in the waves, and many of the men became violently seasick, vomiting over the sides or into their helmets. The smell of diesel fuel and vomit mixed with the salt spray, creating a nauseating cocktail that tested even the strongest stomachs. Bobby Sullivan was green-faced and miserable, but he kept his rifle ready and his eyes forward. Through the mist, James could see the outline of the coast, the cliffs that rose behind Omaha Beach, the obstacles that the Germans had placed in the water. They were supposed to land at low tide, when these obstacles would be visible and easier to avoid, but the timing was off. The tide was higher than expected, and the obstacles were hidden beneath the surface. Around them, other landing crafts were hitting mines, exploding in fountains of water and debris. Men screamed, their voices lost in the chaos of battle. The coxswain was doing his best to navigate through the obstacles, but it was like threading a needle in a storm. James could see the beach now, could see the puffs of sand where German machine gun fire was raking the shoreline. The naval bombardment had done some damage, but not nearly enough. The German defenses were still intact, still operational, and they were waiting. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. James turned to his squad. Remember what I told you. Off the ramp, into the water, and don't stop moving. Stay low and spread out. Follow me to the sea wall. The landing craft lurched as it hit the sandbar, still 50 yards from the beach. This was wrong. They were supposed to land on the sand, not in the water. But there was no time to argue, no time to reconsider. The ramp dropped, and immediately, machine gun fire tore into the men at the front. The first 3 soldiers fell before they could even step off the ramp, their bodies tumbling into the water and turning it red. "Go! Go! Go!" James shouted, pushing past the fallen men and plunging into chest-deep water. The weight of his equipment dragged at him, threatening to pull him under. Around him, men were screaming, dying, drowning. The water erupted with geysers from mortar fire. Bullets zipped past his head with a sound like angry hornets. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Bobby Sullivan was right behind him, struggling to keep his rifle above water. Tommy Chen was to his left, his face set in a grimace of determination. Marcus Washington was moving through the water with powerful strokes, his size and strength giving him an advantage in the deep water. But others weren't so lucky. Joseph Kowalski took a bullet in the throat and went down, his blood spreading across the surface like an oil slick. Private Danny Martinez, a kid from Texas who had just turned 20, stepped on a mine and disappeared in a blast of water and sand. James focused on the beach, on the seawall that offered the only cover. It seemed impossibly far away, an eternity of open ground where death waited with patient certainty. He could see bodies littering the sand, some still moving, most not. Equipment was scattered everywhere, rifles, helmets, backpacks, all the tools of war abandoned by men who no longer needed them. A mortar round landed 10 feet to his right, and the concussion knocked him off his feet. He went under, swallowing salt water, his lungs burning. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him, but then he felt hands grabbing his equipment, pulling him up. It was Marcus Washington, his face covered in blood from a shrapnel wound on his forehead, but his eyes still focused and determined. "Come on, Sarge. We're not dying in the water." Together they made it to the beach, throwing themselves down on the wet sand and trying to find any cover they could. Bodies provided the only real protection, and James hated himself for using them as shields, but survival demanded it. The machine gun fire was constant, a deadly scythe cutting down anyone who tried to advance. The beach was a killing zone, exactly as he had feared, exactly as the intelligence had warned. Bobby Sullivan crawled up next to him, his face pale and spattered with blood that wasn't his own. "What do we do, Sarge? We can't stay here." He was right. The tide was still coming in, and soon the water would reach them where they lay. They had to move forward or die where they were. But the German positions were too strong, too well placed. Every attempt to advance was met with withering fire. James looked around, trying to assess the situation, trying to find a way forward when every option seemed to lead to death. That's when he saw Captain Harrison, or what was left of him. The captain had made it to the beach, but had been hit multiple times trying to rally his men. He lay on his back, his eyes staring sightlessly at the grey sky, his hand still clutching his pistol. The command structure was breaking down. Men were scattered all along the beach, disorganized and leaderless. If someone didn't take charge soon, the entire invasion would fail here on this beach. James made a decision. It wasn't based on training or orders or any rational calculation of odds. It was based on the simple understanding that doing something, even if it was wrong, was better than doing nothing. "Listen up," he shouted to the men around him, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "We can't stay here. We have to move forward. See that pillbox at the base of the cliff? That's our target. We take that out and we open up the whole left side of the beach." "That's suicide," someone yelled back. "Staying here is suicide," James shot back. "At least if we move, we have a chance. On my signal, we're going to make a run for those tank obstacles. They'll give us some cover. Then we move to the shingle, then to the base of the cliff. We go in small groups, leapfrogging forward. Bobby, you take Tommy and Marcus and 3 others. When I give the word, you run like hell. I'll cover you with anyone who stays here. Then you cover us when we move up, understood?" Bobby nodded, his fear evident but controlled. "Understood, Sarge." "Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Bobby and his group launched themselves up and sprinted across the sand, zigzagging to make themselves harder targets. James and the remaining men opened fire on the German positions, not aiming at anything specific, just trying to put enough lead in the air to make the Germans keep their heads down. It worked partially. Bobby's group made it to the tank obstacles with only 1 casualty. A Private James didn't know who took a round in the leg and went down hard. "Our turn," James shouted. "Move!" The second sprint was worse than the first. The Germans had adjusted their fire, and bullets kicked up sand all around them. James felt something tug at his uniform, felt the heat of a near miss. Corporal Hayes went down with a scream, clutching his shattered arm. But James couldn't stop. He dove behind the obstacles and immediately turned to cover the next group. This was how they advanced, yard by bloody yard, leaving bodies behind with each movement. The beach that had seemed so open and impossible began to shrink as they got closer to the base of the cliffs. The angle of fire from the German positions became less effective as they moved into the dead ground beneath the fortifications. Tommy Chen used his knowledge of engineering to identify the weakest points in the German defenses. "There," he pointed, "that pillbox is built into the cliff face. But look at the angle. There's a blind spot on the right side. If we can get there, we can get close enough to use grenades." It was a slim chance, but it was better than no chance at all. James organized what remained of his squad. They were down to 8 men now, 8 out of the 12 who had started the day. "Okay, we're going to work our way along the base of the cliff. Stay in single file. Use whatever cover you can find. Tommy, you lead. You know what you're looking for. Bobby, you're with him. Marcus, you and I will bring up the rear." They moved slowly, carefully, pressing themselves against the cliff face. The sounds of battle raged all around them, the crack of rifles, the boom of artillery, the screams of wounded men. But James forced himself to focus on the immediate task, on the next few yards, the next few steps. That was all that mattered. Get to the pillbox, take it out. Give the men on the beach a chance to advance. They reached the blind spot Tommy had identified, a small depression in the cliff where the machine gun couldn't traverse far enough to hit them. The pillbox was just above them, concrete and steel, impervious to rifle fire. But grenades. Grenades might work if they could get them through the firing slit. "I'll do it," Bobby said before James could volunteer. "I can throw from here. I used to pitch for my high school baseball team. I can make this shot." "Bobby." "It's okay, Sarge. This is what we came here for, right? To do what needs to be done." James looked at the kid, this boy from Boston, who had lied about his age to serve his country, and felt a surge of pride mixed with overwhelming sadness. "Make it count," he said quietly. Bobby pulled the pin on a grenade, counted to 2, and then threw with all his strength a perfect overhand pitch that sent the grenade arcing through the air and through the firing slit of the pillbox. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the explosion, muffled by the concrete but unmistakable. The machine gun fell silent. A cheer went up from the men on the beach who had been pinned down by that position. They began to advance, and with them came more soldiers, more Americans pushing forward despite the casualties, despite the fear. The breakthrough had begun. But the battle was far from over. The Germans had more positions, more machine guns, more artillery, and they were fighting for ground they had held for 4 years. They weren't going to give it up easily. James and his squad continued to advance, clearing obstacles, knocking out strong points, doing the dirty, dangerous work that allowed the main force to push inland. By mid-morning, the beach was still a scene of carnage, but American forces were establishing a foothold. Engineers were clearing obstacles, medics were treating the wounded, and more landing crafts were bringing in reinforcements and supplies. The cost had been terrible. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded on that stretch of sand, but they had succeeded. The beachhead was secure. James sat with his back against a concrete obstacle, utterly exhausted, his uniform soaked with water and blood, most of it not his own. Bobby Sullivan sat next to him, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. Tommy Chen was bandaging a wound on Marcus Washington's arm. Of his original squad of 12, 6 remained. 6 out of 12. 50% casualties, and they were considered lucky. "We did it," Bobby said, his voice hollow with shock. "We actually did it." "We survived the beach," James corrected. "The war's not over. This is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go before we reach Berlin." "Do you think it was worth it, Sarge? All those men who died today?" James looked out at the beach, at the bodies being collected, at the wounded being carried to the aid stations, at the equipment and vehicles being unloaded now that the beach was relatively secure. He thought about the people of France who had lived under Nazi occupation for 4 years. He thought about the concentration camps that intelligence had told them about, the systematic murder of innocent people. He thought about the world his sister Emily would inherit, and whether it would be a world of freedom or tyranny. "Yes," he said finally, "it was worth it. Those men didn't die for nothing. They died so that others could live in freedom. They died believing in something bigger than themselves. That matters. That will always matter." The sound of aircraft overhead drew their attention. American planes flying in formation heading inland to support the advance. The Air Force had control of the skies now. The Navy was bringing in more troops and supplies. The great engine of American industrial and military might was fully engaged, and nothing was going to stop it. James thought about his hometown in Kansas, about Main Street and the hardware store and Sunday school. It all seemed so far away, like a dream from another life. But it was real, and it was worth fighting for. The American dream wasn't just about prosperity or success. It was about the belief that ordinary people working together could accomplish extraordinary things. That freedom and democracy were worth any sacrifice, that the future could be better than the past if people were willing to fight for it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the mist and revealing the full scope of the battlefield, James Mitchell stood up. There was still work to do. The hedgerows of Normandy waited beyond the beach, and beyond them lay the road to Paris, and beyond that, the heart of Nazi Germany itself. It would be a long, brutal campaign, but they would see it through. They were Americans, and they had come too far to turn back now. The first day of the invasion was ending, but the war was just beginning. And James Mitchell, Staff Sergeant in the United States Army, would be there for every step of it, leading his men, honoring the fallen, and fighting for the dream that had brought them all across an ocean to this blood-soaked beach in France. The dream of freedom, the dream of a better world, the American dream. The afternoon brought a new set of challenges as James and his surviving squad members pushed inland from Omaha Beach. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything they had trained for. ancient earthen walls covered in thick, tangled vegetation that divided the countryside into small, maze-like fields. Each hedgerow could hide enemy soldiers. Each field could be a killing zone. The Germans had been preparing for this invasion, and they knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Miller, who had taken command after Captain Harrison's death, called a briefing for the squad leaders who had survived the beach landing. They gathered in a partially destroyed farmhouse just a mile inland, using overturned tables and debris as makeshift seating. Miller was a West Point graduate, a by-the-book officer who had proven himself in North Africa and Sicily. His uniform was caked with mud and blood, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that James recognized, the look of a man who had seen too much death in too short a time. "Gentlemen," Miller began, spreading a map on the floor, "we've secured the beachhead, but our position is precarious. The Germans are counter-attacking along the entire front. Our objective is to link up with the British forces at Gold Beach, establish a continuous front, and begin the push toward Carrington. Intelligence reports that the 352nd Infantry Division is withdrawing to establish a new defensive line, but they're fighting a delaying action at every hedgerow." James studied the map, noting the villages and roads they would need to secure. It was about 5 miles to their first major objective, the town of Vierville-sur-Mer. 5 miles that would probably take days to cover, given the terrain and the enemy resistance. "Sergeant Mitchell," Miller said, "your squad performed exceptionally on the beach. I'm assigning you to lead the advance on this sector." He pointed to a road running through several fields. "Scout ahead, identify enemy positions, and report back. We can't afford to walk into any ambushes. We've lost too many men already." "Yes, sir," James replied. "We'll need a radio operator and possibly a medic. Take whoever you need. And Mitchell, be careful out there. The hedgerows are death traps. The Germans can hear you coming a mile away, and they've had 4 years to learn every field, every lane, every hiding spot." As they prepared to move out, Bobby Sullivan approached James, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The kid had changed in the hours since they hit the beach. The innocence was gone from his eyes, replaced by something harder, older. War had a way of aging people overnight. "Sarge, I've been thinking about what you said on the beach, about those men not dying for nothing. I need to believe that. I need to believe that Mary will understand why I had to be here, why I couldn't just stay in Boston and let other people fight." James put a hand on Bobby's shoulder. "She'll understand, and you're going to get back to her. You're going to tell her about today, about what we did here. Not the horror of it, she doesn't need to carry that burden, but the purpose of it. The fact that we stood up to tyranny and said no more. That's what matters. That's what she'll understand." The patrol moved out in a staggered column, with Tommy Chen on point, using his sharp eyes and engineering knowledge to spot potential ambush sites. Marcus Washington carried the radio, a bulky SCR 300 that weighed 35 pounds, but was their lifeline to command. Corporal Danny Hayes, despite his wounded arm, insisted on coming along. "I can still shoot," he'd said, and James hadn't argued. They had also picked up 2 new members, Private First Class Eddie Rodriguez from Texas, who had survived the beach by sheer luck, and Private William O'Brien from New York, a former cop who had a 6th sense for danger. Hedgerows loomed over them as they moved through the narrow lanes, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of vegetation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of artillery and the occasional burst of small arms fire. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier, every rustle of leaves could signal an ambush. The men moved with exaggerated care, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They had covered maybe half a mile when Tommy raised his fist, signaling a halt. Everyone froze. Tommy pointed ahead, where the lane opened into a small field. James crept forward to join him, staying low, and immediately saw what had alarmed the young soldier. On the far side of the field, partially hidden by another hedgerow, was a German machine gun position. 3 soldiers were visible, one behind the MG-42, the others scanning the approaches with binoculars. James pulled out his own binoculars and studied the position. It was well placed, covering the main approach to the next village. There was no way to bypass it. The hedgerows on either side were too thick to penetrate without making noise, and going around would take hours they didn't have. They would have to take it out. He motioned for his squad to pull back and gathered them in a small depression off the lane. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. Rodriguez, O'Brien, you two work your way around to the left. Stay in the hedgerow. Move slowly. When you're in position, open fire on them. Bobby, Tommy, Marcus, and I will charge straight across the field while they're distracted. Hayes, you stay here with the radio and call in our position. If something goes wrong, get word back to the colonel." "That's a hell of a plan, Sarge," O'Brien said dryly. "Charge a machine gun position across an open field. What could possibly go wrong? You got a better idea?" "Not really, just wanted to confirm that we're all about to do something incredibly stupid." "Welcome to the infantry." Rodriguez and O'Brien disappeared into the hedgerow, moving with the careful patience of hunters stalking dangerous game. James checked his watch, giving them 10 minutes to get into position. The wait was excruciating. Every second felt like an hour. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the Germans could hear it from across the field. Finally, the shooting started. Rodriguez and O'Brien opened up with their M1 Garands, the distinctive ping of the rifles echoing across the field. The German machine gunner swiveled toward the new threat, and that's when James and his team made their move. They burst from cover and ran across the field, pumping their legs as fast as they could, while bullets from their supporting fire kept the Germans' heads down. James could see the machine gunner trying to traverse back toward them, could see the panic in the German soldiers' faces as they realized they were being attacked from 2 directions at once. Bobby reached the position first, diving over the hedgerow and landing practically on top of one of the German soldiers. They grappled for a moment before Bobby brought his rifle butt down hard on the man's skull. Tommy and Marcus hit the position a second later, their rifles barking as they fired at point-blank range. James was right behind them, his Thompson submachine gun spitting lead. The firefight was over in seconds. 3 German soldiers lay dead, and the machine gun position was secured, but the noise had attracted attention. James could hear shouting in German from the next field over, the sound of men mobilizing for a counterattack. "Set up that machine gun," James ordered. "Marcus, get on the radio and tell Hayes to bring up the rest of the squad. We're about to have company." Tommy Chen, who had received some cross-training on German weapons, took position behind the MG-42. The weapon was a fearsome piece of engineering, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The Germans called it Hitler's Zipper because of its distinctive sound. James hoped it would serve them as well as it had served the enemy. The German counterattack came fast and hard. 24 soldiers emerged from the hedgerows, advancing in a disciplined line with covering fire. James and his men opened up with everything they had. The captured machine gun proved its worth, cutting down Germans with brutal efficiency. But there were too many of them, and they were too well trained to be stopped by one machine gun position. "Fall back," James shouted. "Leapfrog to the next hedgerow." Bobby and Rodriguez laid down covering fire, while James, Tommy, and Marcus sprinted back toward the lane. Then they turned and covered, while Bobby's team fell back. It was a fighting retreat, giving ground, but making the Germans pay for every yard. O'Brien was hit during one of these movements, taking a round through his thigh. He went down with a scream, and Eddie Rodriguez immediately ran to his side, grabbing him under the arms and dragging him toward cover. German bullets kicked up dirt all around them, but somehow they made it to the safety of the hedgerow. "How bad?" James asked, kneeling next to the wounded man. "Bad enough," O'Brien grunted through gritted teeth. "But I'll live. Don't you worry about me, Sarge. You worry about those krauts who are trying to kill us." Bead, the German advance had stalled, but it hadn't stopped. They were regrouping, preparing for another push. James knew his small squad couldn't hold this position for long. They needed reinforcements, and they needed them now. "Marcus, where the hell is the rest of the company?" "They're coming, Sarge! Colonel Miller says 15 minutes. "We don't have 15 minutes. Tell him we need support now, or we're going to be overrun." The radio crackled with static as Marcus relayed the message. Meanwhile, James tried to assess their tactical situation. They were in a small depression behind a hedgerow, with Germans to the front and more hedgerows to the sides and rear. Their ammunition was running low, and they had one wounded man who couldn't walk. The only advantage they had was position. They held the high ground, such as it was, and the Germans would have to cross open ground to reach them. "Okay, listen up," James said, gathering his men. "We hold here until the reinforcements arrive. Conserve your ammunition. Make every shot count. Bobby, you and Tommy watch the left flank. Rodriguez, you're on the right. Marcus, stay on that radio. I want constant updates on when our people are going to get here." Bobby wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands shaking slightly. "You think we're going to make it, Sarge? We've made it this far, haven't we? We survived the beach. We took that machine gun position. We fought off one counterattack. We can survive 15 more minutes. We have to, because if we don't, if we let the Germans push us back, then all those men who died on the beach died for nothing. We owe it to them to hold this ground." The words seemed to steady Bobby, seemed to give him something to hold on to. James knew that leadership in combat wasn't about having all the answers or never being afraid. It was about giving your men a reason to keep fighting when every instinct told them to run. It was about making them believe that their sacrifice mattered, that they were part of something larger than themselves. The second German attack came 5 minutes later, and it was more aggressive than the first. They had brought up a light mortar, and shells began falling around the American position, showering them with dirt and shrapnel. Tommy Chen took a piece of metal in his shoulder, but kept firing, his face set in a grimace of pain and determination. James spotted a German officer directing the attack, a tall man with a distinctive scar on his face, visible even at this distance. He was organizing his men with hand signals, positioning them for a coordinated assault. James raised his Thompson and fired a burst in the officer's direction, but the range was too great for the submachine gun. The officer ducked behind cover, unhurt. The Germans were getting closer, advancing in short rushes while laying down heavy covering fire. James could hear bullets whipping past his head, could smell the cordite and the churned earth. They were running out of time and ammunition. Where the hell were the reinforcements? Then, like a gift from heaven, he heard it, the distinctive sound of American tanks. Two M4 Shermans came rumbling down the lane, their 75mm main guns traversing toward the German positions. Infantry followed behind them, using the tanks as mobile cover. It was the most beautiful sight James had ever seen. The Shermans opened fire, their high-explosive shells tearing into the hedgerows where the Germans were positioned. The effect was immediate and devastating. The German attack fell apart, the soldiers retreating in disarray, some throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Miller was with the relief force, and he strode over to James's position with a look of grim satisfaction. "Good work, Sergeant. You held them off long enough for us to get organized. How many casualties?" "One wounded, sir. O'Brien took a round in the leg. Tommy Chen has some shrapnel in his shoulder, but he's still combat effective." Miller nodded, then looked at the captured German machine gun position, at the bodies of enemy soldiers, at the evidence of fierce fighting. "You and your men have done enough for one day. Fall back to the aid station, get patched up, get some rest. We'll handle the advance from here. With respect, sir, we can keep going. My men are tired, but they're not done." Miller studied James for a long moment. "You've been fighting since 06:30 this morning. It's now 1600 hours. That's over 9 hours of continuous combat. Your men need rest, and frankly, so do you. That's not a request, Sergeant. That's an order. Yes, sir. As they made their way back toward the beach, helping O'Brien limp along between them, James felt the exhaustion finally catching up with him. His legs felt like lead, his arms ached from carrying his weapon, and his mind was foggy with fatigue. But underneath it all was a sense of accomplishment, of purpose fulfilled. They had done what they came to do. They had fought, they had won, and they had survived. The aid station was a scene of controlled chaos. Medics worked on dozens of wounded men, performing triage, stabilizing the most critical cases, and preparing them for evacuation. The smell of blood and disinfectant was overwhelming. James left O'Brien in the capable hands of a doctor and went to check on the rest of his squad. Bobby Sullivan was sitting on an empty ammunition crate, staring at his hands. They were covered in blood, some his own from minor cuts and abrasions, most of it from other men he had helped during the day. James sat down next to him, neither of them speaking for a while. "I killed a man today," Bobby finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hit him with my rifle, and I felt his skull break. I looked into his eyes, and I saw him die. He was just a kid, Sarge, probably not much older than me. Maybe he had a girl back home too, maybe parents who loved him. And I killed him." James had been waiting for this moment. Every soldier eventually had to confront what they had done, what war had turned them into. There were no easy answers, no words that could make it better. But he had to try. "You did what you had to do to survive, Bobby. That German soldier was trying to kill you, was trying to kill all of us. If you hadn't stopped him, he would have stopped you. That's the reality of war. It's not about right and wrong anymore. It's about survival. About making sure you get home to Mary, about making sure your brothers in arms get home to their families. You did nothing wrong. You did what any soldier would do, what any man trying to stay alive would do." But does it get easier? Does the guilt go away? "No," James said honestly. "It doesn't get easier. You'll remember that man's face for the rest of your life. But over time, you'll learn to carry it. You'll understand that his death had meaning, that it contributed to the liberation of Europe, to the defeat of tyranny. That doesn't make it easy, but it makes it bearable." Bobby nodded slowly, processing this. "I enlisted because I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to do something that mattered, something that people would remember. But this doesn't feel like being a hero. It feels like... I don't even know what it feels like." "Being a hero isn't about feeling a certain way," James said. "It's about doing what needs to be done, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. You charged a machine gun position today. You helped take ground that will allow thousands of other soldiers to advance inland. You saved lives by your actions. That's heroism, Bobby. It doesn't feel glorious because real heroism never does. It feels like fear and exhaustion and guilt. But it matters. You matter. Don't ever forget that." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The sounds of battle had moved inland, growing more distant as the American forces pushed deeper into France. The beach that had been a scene of such carnage that morning was now a logistics hub, with supplies and reinforcements flowing in steadily. The invasion had succeeded. The Allies had their foothold in France. From here, there would be no turning back. That evening, after they had eaten their first hot meal of the day and had their wounds properly treated, the squad gathered around a small fire. They were joined by other soldiers from their company, men who had survived the beach and the hedgerows, who had fought and bled and lost friends. Someone had found a bottle of cognac in an abandoned French farmhouse, and they passed it around, each man taking a small sip in memory of the fallen. Tommy Chen raised the bottle. "To Captain Harrison, who led us onto that beach." "To Captain Harrison," the others echoed. "To Joseph Kowalski," Bobby added, "who never made it out of the water. To Kowalski." To Danny Martinez and all the others who fell today, James said, may their sacrifice never be forgotten. They continued like this, naming the dead, honoring their memory. It was a ritual as old as warfare itself, a way of ensuring that those who had given their lives would not disappear into anonymous statistics. Each name was a story, a life cut short, a family that would receive a telegram with words no parent or spouse ever wanted to read. Marcus Washington, who had been quiet most of the evening, finally spoke up. My father told me something before I left home. He said that every generation of Americans has had to fight for freedom. Sometimes that fight is on the battlefield, sometimes it's at home, fighting against injustice and inequality, but the fight never ends. We won a battle today, an important battle, but the war goes on, and it goes on even after this war ends. We have to be ready for that. We have to make sure that what we're fighting for here, freedom, democracy, equality, we have to make sure those things are real back home too. His words hung in the air, profound and challenging. James thought about segregation, about the Jim Crow laws that still existed in parts of America, about the fact that Marcus had to fight and bleed for a country that didn't always treat him as an equal citizen. It was a contradiction that made James uncomfortable, but Marcus was right. Winning the war abroad wouldn't mean much if they didn't address the injustices at home. Your father sounds like a wise man, James said. And he's right. We're fighting for an ideal here, a vision of what America can be. When we get home, we have to make sure that vision becomes reality for everyone, not just some of us. The fire burned down to embers, and one by one the men drifted off to find places to sleep. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more hedgerows, more German soldiers defending every inch of ground. But tonight they had survived. They had proven to themselves and to the world that American soldiers could stand up to the best the Wehrmacht had to offer and prevail. James lay on his back, looking up at the stars that were just becoming visible through breaks in the clouds. He thought about his sister Emily, who would be 12 years old now. He had promised her in his letters that he would come home, that he would survive this war and return to Kansas and help her with her homework and walk her down the aisle when she got married someday. It was a promise he intended to keep. But he knew that every day brought new dangers, new ways to die. All he could do was be smart, be careful, and keep his men alive as long as possible. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder. The war went on, relentless and unforgiving. But for this one night, James Mitchell and his squad had earned their rest. They had stormed the beaches of Normandy, had fought through the hedgerows, had helped secure a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. They were part of history now, part of the greatest military operation ever undertaken, and whatever else happened, whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together as brothers in arms, as Americans fighting for freedom and democracy and the future of the world. The American dream had brought them here, across an ocean and into hell, but it was also what would see them through, what would give them the strength to keep fighting, keep pushing forward, keep believing that a better world was possible. Because that's what Americans did. They believed in tomorrow. They believed that freedom was worth any price, and they believed in each other. As James finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of home, of Main Street in Meadowbrook, of ordinary Americans living ordinary lives in extraordinary times. He was fighting for them, for their right to live in peace, to pursue their dreams, to build a better future for their children. That was worth everything. That was worth the blood and the horror and the sacrifice. That was the American dream, and it was a dream worth dying for. The days following the initial assault at Omaha Beach blurred together into a continuous grind of combat that tested every man to his limits. The hedgerows of Normandy, which the French called bocage, proved to be a nightmare for American forces. Each field was a potential battlefield, each hedgerow a fortress that had to be assaulted individually. The German defenders had transformed this pastoral landscape into a deadly maze, where advance was measured in yards, not miles, and where the cost in blood seemed disproportionate to the ground gained. James Mitchell and his squad became experts in hedgerow warfare through brutal trial and error. They learned to use Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes through the earthen walls, learned to coordinate tank and infantry assaults, learned where to expect German ambushes and how to counter them. But knowledge came at a price, and that price was paid in the lives and limbs of young American soldiers. On the third day after the landing, they were assigned to clear a small village called Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, just 2 miles inland from Omaha Beach. Intelligence reported that a company of German infantry was using the village as a strong point, and Lieutenant Colonel Miller wanted it taken before nightfall to secure the supply routes from the beach. The approach to the village was across open farmland, offering no cover except for the ubiquitous hedgerows. James studied the terrain through his binoculars, noting the church steeple that dominated the village centre, an obvious position for German spotters. The stone buildings offered excellent defensive positions, and there were multiple approach routes that would need to be covered. "This is going to be tough," Tommy Chen observed, crouching next to James behind a hedgerow. His shoulder was still bandaged from the shrapnel wound, but he had refused evacuation. "They can see us coming from a mile away, and those stone buildings will stop anything we can throw at them short of tank rounds." "That's why we're bringing tanks," James replied. "Miller's assigned us 2 Shermans and a full platoon of infantry. We'll have numerical superiority at least." Bobby Sullivan, who had been promoted to corporal after their performance on D-Day, came up with news from the briefing. "The plan is to approach from 3 directions simultaneously. We're taking the south road into town. 2nd platoon takes the east, 3rd platoon the west. The tanks will support the main thrust, that's us, while the other platoons try to get into the town and clear it building by building." "Any word on civilian casualties?" Marcus Washington asked. The big man had become increasingly concerned about the French civilians caught in the crossfire of liberation. They had seen too many bodies of innocent people killed by artillery or caught between the fighting forces. "The village was evacuated 3 days ago," Bobby said. "At least that's what the Free French scouts reported, but you know how reliable that intelligence can be." James nodded grimly. They had learned not to trust intelligence reports completely. Too often, what command thought was true bore little resemblance to reality on the ground. They would proceed carefully, assuming civilians might still be present, because the alternative, killing innocent people, was something he didn't want on his conscience. The assault began at 1400 hours with an artillery barrage that pounded the village for 15 minutes. James watched the shells explode among the buildings, sending up clouds of dust and debris. It was meant to soften up the German defenses, but he knew from experience that it probably wouldn't kill many enemy soldiers. They would be in cellars, in fortified positions, waiting for the barrage to end and the infantry assault to begin. When the artillery fell silent, the Shermans rumbled forward, their engines roaring, their treads churning up the dirt road. James and his squad followed behind the lead tank, using it as mobile cover. The other 2 squads in their platoon followed behind the 2nd Sherman. It felt safer having those 30 tons of steel between them and the German positions, but James knew that tanks were also bullet magnets. They drew enemy fire, and anyone too close to them when they were hit would be caught in the explosion. They were halfway to the village when the Germans opened fire. A Panzerfaust, a German anti-tank rocket, streaked out from one of the buildings and slammed into the lead Sherman. The tank erupted in flames, and James felt the wave of heat wash over him. The crew had no chance. The tank commander who had been in the turret was killed instantly, and the driver and gunner were trapped inside the burning hull. "Spread out! Get off the road!" James shouted, and his squad scattered into the ditches on either side. Machine gun fire raked their position, and he heard someone scream. Looking back, he saw that one of the new replacements, a kid whose name he hadn't even learned yet, was down with bullets in his chest. The second Sherman had stopped and was traversing its turret, trying to locate the source of the Panzerfaust. The 75mm gun fired, and the building where the rocket had come from collapsed in a cloud of dust and smoke. There were more German positions, more machine guns opening up from windows and doorways throughout the village. "Bobby! Take your fire team and work around to the left. Tommy, you go right. We'll suppress the German positions while you flank them." James's training took over, his mind processing the tactical situation and issuing orders even as bullets whipped past his head. Bobby nodded and led 3 men in a crouching run toward a stone wall that would give them cover. Tommy and his team went the opposite direction. James, Marcus, and Eddie Rodriguez stayed in the ditch, firing their weapons at the German positions, trying to keep the enemy's heads down. The second Sherman moved forward cautiously, its turret sweeping back and forth, looking for targets. James saw a German soldier dash between buildings, carrying another Panzerfaust, and he shouted a warning. "Tank! Enemy on your left!" The tank's bow machine gun chattered, cutting down the German soldier before he could fire his weapon. The Panzerfaust fell from his dead hands and exploded harmlessly against the ground. One threat eliminated, but there would be more. The Germans had learned to save their anti-tank weapons for close range, where they were most effective. Bobby's team reached their flanking position and opened fire on a German machine gun nest. The sudden attack from the side caught the Germans by surprise, and the machine gun fell silent. Bobby signaled success, and James motioned for the rest of his squad to advance. They moved forward in short rushes, covering each other, using whatever concealment they could find. The entrance to the village was littered with rubble from the artillery barrage, which provided some cover but also created obstacles that slowed their advance. James could hear firing from the other sides of the village. Second and third platoons were engaging as well, dividing the German defenders' attention. The first building they reached was a small cottage with its roof partially collapsed. James kicked in the door and went in fast, his Thompson ready. The interior was a disaster. Furniture overturned, walls pocked with bullet holes, plaster and debris covering everything. But there were no Germans, and thankfully no civilians. He signaled clear, and his squad moved on to the next building. The village square was the center of German resistance. They had established positions in the church, in the town hall, and in several shops around the square. Any attempt to cross the open space would be suicide. The Sherman had positioned itself at the entrance to the square and was trading shots with German positions, its 75mm gun demolishing buildings one by one. But tanks couldn't clear buildings. That required infantry willing to go room to room, risking their lives with every door they opened. "We need to get into that church," James said, studying the situation. "That steeple is giving them overwatch of the entire village. As long as they hold it, they can coordinate their defense. Take it out, and we break their spine." "The front entrance is covered by at least 2 machine guns," Tommy pointed out. "We'd never make it across the square." "Then we don't go through the front. Look there." James pointed to a narrow alley between 2 buildings. "That runs behind the church. If we can get through there, we can hit the back entrance. It's probably less defended." "Probably," Marcus said skeptically. "What if it's a trap? Then we deal with it. But we can't stay here. We have to keep moving forward." They worked their way around the square, using the buildings as cover, moving carefully to avoid German fire. The alley was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. James went first, his Thompson pointed ahead, every sense alert for danger. Behind him came Bobby, then Tommy, then the rest of the squad. The back of the church had a small door, old and weathered, that probably led to a vestry or storage room. James tried the handle and found it unlocked. That made him nervous. The Germans weren't usually so careless, but they had no choice. He eased the door open and looked inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the sunlight streaming through holes in the roof where artillery shells had penetrated. Wooden pews were overturned and splintered. The altar had been converted into a German command post, with maps and radio equipment spread across it. And standing behind the altar, as if guarding this desecrated holy place, was a German officer. The same officer James had seen during the hedgerow fighting, the one with the distinctive scar on his face. For a frozen moment, the two men stared at each other across the ruined church. Then training and instinct took over. James raised his Thompson, but the German was faster, diving behind the altar as James's burst of fire splintered the wood where he had been standing. Return fire came from multiple directions. There were more Germans in the church than James had thought, concealed in the shadows, in the choir loft, behind pillars. "Contact! Multiple hostiles!" James shouted as he threw himself behind a pew. His squad poured through the door, spreading out, seeking cover, returning fire. The church became a cacophony of gunfire, the muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like lightning. Tommy Chen pulled the pin on a grenade and threw it toward the altar. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and plaster rained down from the ceiling. Through the smoke and dust, James saw German soldiers stumbling, disoriented. He fired controlled bursts, dropping 2 of them. Bobby flanked left, working his way toward the choir loft, where a German sniper had taken position. Marcus Washington charged straight up the center aisle, his size and momentum carrying him forward, despite the bullets that snapped around him. The German officer emerged from behind the ruined altar, a Luger pistol in his hand. He and James locked eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation. They fired simultaneously. James felt something punch him in the shoulder, spinning him around. But his burst caught the German officer in the chest, and the man went down hard, his pistol clattering across the stone floor. The fight for the church lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the firing finally stopped, 8 German soldiers lay dead, including their officer. James's squad had suffered casualties too. Eddie Rodriguez had taken a bullet in his leg, and one of the new replacements was dead, shot through the throat. "Sarge, you're hit," Bobby said, rushing over to James. James looked down at his shoulder and saw blood spreading across his uniform. The German officer's shot had caught him, but it had been at a bad angle. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone. It hurt like hell, but it wasn't life-threatening. "I'm fine. Check on Rodriguez and get someone up in that steeple. Signal the tank that we've secured the church." Tommy Chen helped James with the field dressing, while Bobby and Marcus cleared the rest of the church. They found more Germans hiding in the basement, scared young soldiers barely out of their teens, who surrendered without a fight. James made them sit against a wall with their hands on their heads while he decided what to do with them. With the church secured, German resistance in the village began to collapse. Without the coordination from their command post, without the overwatch from the steeple, the scattered German positions were isolated and vulnerable. Second and third platoons pushed into the square from their sides, and within an hour, Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer was in American hands. The cost had been high. Platoon had lost 6 men killed and twice that many wounded. The Sherman crew had burned to death in their tank. Dozens of buildings had been destroyed, and while no civilians had been killed in this particular village, James knew that wasn't always the case. War was messy, brutal, and indiscriminate in its destruction. Lieutenant Colonel Miller arrived as they were securing the prisoners and collecting the dead. He surveyed the village, his expression grim. "Good work, Sergeant. This village controls the road network to Carrington. Holding it means we can bring up supplies and reinforcements more efficiently." "Yes, sir," James replied, trying not to wince as the medic tightened the bandage on his shoulder. Miller noticed the wound. "That needs proper treatment. I'm ordering you back to the aid station." "I can still fight, sir." "I'm not questioning your courage, Mitchell, but you're no good to your men if that wound gets infected or you pass out from blood loss. Go to the aid station, get properly patched up, rest for a day or two, then come back. Your squad will manage without you for 48 hours. Corporal Sullivan can take command." Bobby looked alarmed at this, but James nodded. Miller was right. He needed medical attention, and Bobby had proven himself capable during the fighting. The aid station had been set up in a commandeered French farmhouse about a mile behind the lines. It was organized chaos, medics moving between patients, sorting them by severity of injury, doing what they could with limited supplies and equipment. The seriously wounded were being prepared for evacuation to England, where they could receive proper hospital care. Those with minor wounds would be patched up and sent back to their units. James waited his turn, watching the medics work with efficient precision. A doctor finally got to him. A captain from Philadelphia who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. He examined the shoulder wound, probing it with instruments that made James grit his teeth against the pain. "You're lucky," the doctor said. "Clean through and through. No major damage to bone or arteries. I'll clean it, stitch it up, give you some sulfur powder to prevent infection, and you should be good to go in a couple of days. Try not to use that arm too much." "In the middle of a war?" James asked with a weak smile. "Yeah, I know. Just do your best. I've seen too many minor wounds turn fatal because men didn't give themselves time to heal." As the doctor worked, James thought about the German officer he had killed in the church. The man had fought bravely, had commanded his men well, had done his duty as he saw it. In another time, another place, they might have been friends, might have shared a drink and talked about their families. But war made enemies of men who had no personal quarrel, who were simply serving the countries they loved. He thought about the young German soldiers they had taken prisoner, scared kids who looked relieved that their war was over. They would spend the rest of the conflict in POW camps, but at least they would survive. Their families would eventually get them back, unlike the families of the German soldiers lying dead in the church and throughout the village. War didn't make sense when you thought about it too hard. The best you could do was focus on the mission, on protecting your brothers in arms, on winning so you could go home. The bigger questions about justice and morality and the cost of victory, those would have to wait until the shooting stopped. After being treated, James was given a cot in a corner of the farmhouse and told to rest. He tried to sleep, but his mind was too active, replaying the battles of the past few days, thinking about the men under his command, wondering what was happening with his squad while he was stuck here. Finally, he gave up on sleep and went outside to smoke a cigarette. The sun was setting, painting the French countryside in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, serene, completely at odds with the violence that had consumed this land for the past week. In the distance, he could hear artillery fire. The war was moving inland, toward the hedgerows and fields that stood between the Allies and their objectives deeper in France. A chaplain approached him, a young priest named Father O'Malley who had landed with the second wave on D-Day. "Mind if I join you, Sergeant? Free country, Father, or at least it's getting there." O'Malley smiled at that and pulled out his own cigarettes. They smoked in companionable silence for a few minutes, two men finding brief peace in a world gone mad. "I've been talking to a lot of the wounded," O'Malley said eventually. "Hearing confessions, giving last rites when needed. The things these boys carry, it's a heavy burden. That's war, Father. It changes you, takes something from you that you can never get back. But it also reveals character. I've seen incredible acts of courage and selflessness. Men sacrificing themselves for their buddies, medics running into fire to save the wounded, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That gives me hope." James thought about Bobby Sullivan charging the machine gun position, about Marcus Washington pulling him from the water on Omaha Beach, about Tommy Chen fighting on despite his wound. "Yeah," he said quietly. "There's that too. When everything else is stripped away, when you're facing death, that's when you see who people really are. And a lot of these boys, these men, they're better than they ever knew. What about you, Sergeant? How are you holding up?" It was a simple question, but it hit James harder than he expected. How was he holding up? He was exhausted, wounded, haunted by the faces of the men he had killed and the men he had failed to save. He was thousands of miles from home, fighting a war that seemed to have no end. But he was also alive, still able to fight, still able to lead his men, and maybe make a difference in this terrible conflict. "I'm still here, Father. That's about all I can say." O'Malley nodded, seeming to understand what James wasn't saying. "Well, if you ever need to talk about anything, you know where to find me. Sometimes it helps to unburden yourself, to speak the things we carry inside." "I appreciate that, Father. But right now, what I need most is to get back to my squad. They're out there fighting, and I should be with them. Rest first. Heal. You're no good to them if you collapse from exhaustion or infection. Trust that they can manage without you for a little while. You've trained them well." That night, James did manage to sleep, a deep, dreamless sleep that his body desperately needed. When he woke the next morning, his shoulder was stiff and painful, but the wound showed no signs of infection. The doctor checked on him and pronounced him fit to return to duty in another day, but events were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Word came that the German army was preparing a major counterattack, trying to push the Allies back into the sea before they could fully consolidate their beachhead. Every available man was being called up, including the walking wounded. James found Lieutenant Colonel Miller in the village, coordinating the defense with his company commanders. "Sir, I'm ready to return to my squad." Miller looked at him skeptically. "The doctor cleared you. He said I could fight if necessary, and it sounds like it's necessary. The Germans are throwing everything they have at us. Panzer divisions, SS troops, everything. If they break through, this whole invasion could fall apart. We need every man who can hold a rifle." Miller paused, then nodded. "All right, Sergeant. Your squad is positioned on the eastern edge of the village. Corporal Sullivan has done a good job in your absence, but I'm sure they'll be glad to have you back." James found his squad dug in behind a stone wall, their weapons pointing toward the fields beyond the village. Bobby looked up as he approached, and relief flooded his face. "Sarge, we heard you were hit. How's the shoulder?" "Still attached. That's what matters. What's the situation?" "German armor is moving up. Intelligence says at least a company of panzers, supported by infantry. They're going to hit us at dawn tomorrow. We've got bazooka teams positioned, mines laid in the approaches, and artillery support on call. But if they break through our line, there's not much between them and the beach." James surveyed their position. It was as good as could be expected. Solid cover, good fields of fire, multiple fallback positions if they were overrun. But stone walls and rifle pits wouldn't stand up to German tanks. They would need luck and skill, and every advantage they could get. That night the squad huddled together in the darkness, sharing rations and quiet conversation. The fear was palpable, but so was the determination. These men had survived Omaha Beach, had fought through the hedgerows, had taken this village building by building. They weren't about to give it up without a fight. Marcus Washington shared a letter he had received from his father, smuggled through the mail despite the chaos of the invasion. He says the whole town is praying for us, says people are following the news, cheering every mile we advance. They're proud of us, proud that we're fighting for freedom. "My Mary wrote too," Bobby said. "She's working in a factory now, making ammunition. Says she thinks about me every time she puts a bullet in a crate, hopes it will help keep me safe." Isn't that something? She's fighting this war too, in her own way. Tommy Chen pulled out the letter he always carried from his parents. My father says that America gave our family a chance at a better life. He says it's an honor to have a son fighting to defend that chance. He doesn't understand the reality of it, the blood and the fear, but he understands the principle. That's what we're fighting for. The principle that people should be free, that they should have a chance to build a better life. James listened to his men and felt a surge of pride. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers and factory workers, students and shopkeepers, ordinary Americans who had been thrust into extraordinary circumstances. But they had risen to the challenge. They had become warriors, not because they loved violence, but because they loved freedom more than they feared death. When the attack comes tomorrow, James said, remember why we're here. Remember the people back home counting on us. Remember the men who died on that beach so we could be sitting here right now. We owe it to them to hold this line. We owe it to ourselves to prove that democracy can stand up to tyranny. We owe it to the future to make sure that our children and grandchildren grow up in a free world. If you've been moved by this story of courage and sacrifice, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories matter, and sharing them helps preserve the memory of those who gave everything for freedom. The German attack began at first light, preceded by an artillery barrage that shook the ground and filled the air with smoke and debris. James crouched behind the stone wall, his wounded shoulder throbbing as shells exploded around their position. This was different from the sporadic fire they had experienced before. This was a full-scale assault, a desperate attempt to drive the Americans back. When the barrage lifted, the panzers came. They emerged from the morning mist like iron monsters, their cannons firing, their machine guns chattering. Behind them came German infantry, moving in disciplined formations, taking advantage of the cover provided by their tanks. "Bazooka teams, light 'em up!" James shouted, and the American anti-tank weapons began to fire. The 1st Panzer took a rocket to its side armor and ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But there were more, many more, and they kept coming. The Sherman tank that had been supporting their sector fired its 75mm gun, hitting a Panzer squarely in the turret. The German tank exploded in a fireball that lit up the dawn. But return fire from another Panzer hit the Sherman, and James watched in horror as the American crew bailed out, their uniforms on fire. "Fall back to 2nd position!" Lieutenant Colonel Miller's voice crackled over the radio. "Fighting retreat, make them pay for every yard." James and his squad began a controlled withdrawal, firing as they went, using every bit of cover. The German infantry was pressing hard, trying to exploit the breakthrough their armor had created. Bobby Sullivan stopped to help a wounded soldier from another squad, dragging him back toward the aid station while bullets kicked up dirt around them. Tommy Chen spotted a German officer directing the attack and took careful aim with his M1 Garand. The shot was perfect. The officer went down, and the German advance faltered momentarily as command and control broke down. It wasn't much, but it bought them precious seconds. The fighting raged through the morning and into the afternoon. The Germans threw everything they had at the American positions: tanks, infantry, artillery, even aircraft that strafed the defenders with machine gun fire. But the Americans held. They bent, they gave ground when they had to, but they didn't break. James was everywhere, directing fire, encouraging his men, filling gaps in the line when soldiers fell. His shoulder screamed with pain every time he fired his Thompson, but he ignored it. There would be time for pain later if he survived. Right now, his men needed him, and he wasn't going to let them down. By late afternoon, the German attack began to falter. They had taken heavy casualties, lost most of their armor, and failed to achieve the breakthrough they needed. American reinforcements were arriving, fresh troops who had landed that morning and pushed inland to shore up the defensive line. The tide was turning. As the sun began to set, the Germans withdrew, leaving their dead and wounded on the field. The Americans had held. The beachhead was secure. The invasion would continue. James sat down heavily, his back against a bullet-scarred wall, utterly spent. Around him, his squad was in similar condition, filthy, exhausted, but alive. They had survived another day, another battle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but for now they had won. Lieutenant Colonel Miller came by to check on them, and there was something different in his expression. Pride, maybe, or respect. "Hell of a job, Sergeant. You and your men stopped them cold. The whole line might have collapsed if not for units like yours holding firm. Just doing our duty, sir." It was more than duty. It was courage, real courage. Miller looked at the assembled squad. "Every one of you men should be proud of what you've accomplished. You've helped secure the future of freedom in Europe. Your grandchildren will learn about what you did here." After Miller left, the squad sat in silence, too tired even to celebrate their victory. The cost had been high, more men wounded, more friends lost, but they had held the line. They had proven that American soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with the best the German army could throw at them and emerge victorious. As darkness fell and the sounds of battle faded into the distance, James thought about the long road that still lay ahead. They were barely into France. Between them and Germany lay hundreds of miles of enemy territory, fortified cities, determined defenders. The war was far from over. But they had taken the first steps. They had stormed the beaches, fought through the hedgerows, held the line against counterattack. Each victory built on the last. Each day brought them closer to the ultimate goal, the defeat of Nazi tyranny and the liberation of Europe. James looked at his men, Bobby Sullivan, who had grown from a scared kid into a reliable leader, Tommy Chen, whose intelligence and courage had saved them multiple times, Marcus Washington, whose strength and determination inspired them all. These men were the embodiment of the American spirit, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, fighting not for conquest or glory, but for the simple belief that freedom was worth defending. The American dream had brought them here, and it would see them through whatever lay ahead, because that dream was more than just prosperity or success. It was the belief that every person deserved the chance to live in freedom, to pursue their own happiness, to build a better world for their children. And if that dream was worth living for, then it was certainly worth fighting for. As James finally allowed himself to close his eyes and rest, his last thought was a simple prayer for the men who had fallen, for the men still fighting, and for the day when they could all go home, having done their part to preserve freedom for generations yet unborn. That was the true meaning of their sacrifice. That was the legacy they would leave behind. And in that legacy, the American dream would live on, eternal and undefeated.